If there is a moment in medieval history when the fate of an entire kingdom collapsed because of a single decision, it happened in the blazing summer of 1127. The Crusades are often remembered through images of clashing swords, pious knights, and grand sieges, but the truth is far more subtle. Some battles are not won by brute strength, but by the steady pressure of heat, hunger, thirst, and fatal human arrogance. And on a scorched plateau in Galilee, in the shadow of two rocky hills known as the Horns of Hattin, it was not steel, but sun, dust, miscalculation, and a master strategist that determined the destiny of Jerusalem. The Battle of Hattin stands as one of the most decisive turning points of the Middle Ages. In only a few days, the mightiest army the Crusader kingdom had assembled in decades was reduced to ashes. But to understand how such a collapse was possible, one must look back through decades of political scheming, fractured alliances, personal ambition, religious zealotry, and the slow but relentless rise of one man. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Latin world simply as Saladin. For nearly a century, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had stood as a fragile outpost of Western Christendom, carved into the heart of the Middle East. Its castles crowned the ridges of desert hills. Its knights, armored in shining mail, patrolled the caravan routes, and its kings ruled from the sacred city seized during the First Crusade. From the outside, the kingdom seemed powerful and unshakable. But inside, it had been hollowed out by internal division, mistrust, greed, and the steady erosion of unity. By 1187, the kingdom's greatest enemy was not the Muslim armies gathering on its borders. It was itself. Two rival factions, two irreconcilable visions of the future, had split the Crusader leadership into bitter camps. One side argued for restraint and diplomacy, the other demanded endless holy war, and the monarch caught in between lacked the strength to control either. Raymond III of Tripoli, leader of the so-called Peace Party, was one of the few noblemen born in the Holy Land. Unlike most Frankish lords, who had arrived from Europe with narrow understanding and burning religious passion, Raymond understood the politics, languages, customs, and brutal realities of the region. He knew that the Crusader kingdom was too small and too isolated to wage constant war against a Muslim world that was finally beginning to unify under Saladin's banner. Raymond had lived his entire life in the East. He could speak Arabic. He had fought countless skirmishes, and he had learned the hard lessons of survival. Peace, he believed, was not cowardice but strategy. Facing him was the war party, dominated by newcomers from Europe, knights who viewed the Holy Land not as a home to be protected, but as a stage for glory, plunder, and spiritual triumph. Their leaders were the ferocious Renaud de Chatillon, lord of the desert fortress of Kerak, and Gérard de Riedfort, the tempestuous and unyielding master of the Knights Templar. These men despised compromise. To them, peace was betrayal, negotiation was weakness, and coexistence with Muslims was unthinkable. They arrived in the Holy Land with the conviction that God himself demanded perpetual war. At the center of this storm stood King Guy de Lusignan, a man placed on the throne through marriage rather than merit. Weak-willed, inexperienced, and plagued by insecurity, Guy vacillated endlessly between the two factions, trying to appease both and satisfying neither. Raymond viewed him as incompetent. The war party manipulated him easily. Under his rule, unity dissolved, and every decision became a battlefield of political intrigue. Saladin watched all of this unfold with keen interest. He understood that his greatest advantage was not the size of his army, but the deep divisions within the Crusader leadership. He knew who hated whom, who trusted whom, and how easily pride could overwhelm reason. While he consolidated Egypt and Syria into a united power, the Crusaders tore themselves apart. The final spark that ignited the coming inferno occurred in 1186, when Renaud de Chatillon committed the most reckless act of his life, and perhaps of the entire Crusader period. From his impregnable fortress, he attacked a rich caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus, capturing merchants, travelers, and, according to some accounts, Saladin's own sister. This was not mere banditry. It was a direct violation of a formal truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin demanded the return of the captives and their goods. King Guy ordered Renaud to comply, but Renaud laughed in his face and responded with stunning arrogance. "I am as much a king in my lands as Guy is in his." Those words sealed his fate. They also sealed the fate of the Crusader kingdom. Saladin had waited years for a legitimate excuse to declare holy war, a war he intended not to win narrowly, but to win completely. Now he had it. He swore a solemn oath that he would kill Renaud with his own hands, and with that vow echoing behind him, he summoned a massive army from every corner of his domain. The Crusaders panicked. They argued. They blamed each other. But they refused to face the simple truth. They were no longer dealing with fragmented Muslim states. They were facing a unified empire under a commander whose patience, discipline, and vision far surpassed their own. Saladin's plan for destroying the Crusader kingdom was brutally elegant. He did not want a series of small victories. He wanted one great battle, one overwhelming, decisive blow that would wipe out the Crusader field army entirely. Only then would the castles and cities of the kingdom crumble one after another like stones in a collapsing tower. To force that decisive battle, he needed bait. He found it in Tiberias, a lakeside city belonging to Raymond of Tripoli. Saladin marched across the Jordan River, invaded Raymond's territory, and laid siege to the city. The lower town fell instantly, the citadel held out, and inside that fortress was Raymond's wife, trapped and surrounded. At Acre, where the Crusader lords gathered, the situation seemed straightforward. They were encamped at Sephoria, the single best position in the region. The ground was open and flat. The springs provided abundant water, and the army was refreshed, rested, and ready. If they remained there, Saladin would be forced to attack them on ground of their choosing, exactly what the Crusader army excelled at. Raymond stood before them and made a speech that should have changed the fate of history. Calm despite the danger to his wife, he begged them not to march. He warned that Saladin was deliberately provoking them, luring them away from water, driving them into a trap. He insisted that the kingdom's survival depended on staying exactly where they were, no matter what happened to Tiberias. His words were met with cold fury. Gerard de Riedfort, burning with anger after a recent disastrous defeat, accused Raymond of treachery. He claimed that Raymond was secretly negotiating with Saladin. Renaud de Chatillon echoed these accusations, pushing the council into chaos. The younger knights shouted that it would be cowardice and shame to let Saladin burn Christian cities unopposed. They demanded war. They demanded movement. They demanded action. King Guy wavered. All night he hesitated, torn between reason and pride. He knew Raymond was right, but he feared humiliation more than he feared annihilation. And just before dawn, Gerard de Riedfort entered the royal tent one last time. His words were simple but devastating. If the king refused to march, history would remember him as a coward. At sunrise on July 3, 1187, Guy de Lusignan made the most catastrophic decision of his reign. He ordered the army to march toward Tiberias. It was the moment the Crusader kingdom signed its own death warrant. The army set out in grand formation, nearly 2,000 armored knights, the elite of Latin Christendom, riding alongside 15,000 infantry. At the center they carried their holiest relic, a fragment of the true cross, believed to carry divine protection. Their banners fluttered under the blazing sky as they marched away from the cool springs of Sephoria and into the wasteland. The road ahead wound through barren hills with no wells, no shade, and no hope of relief. It was a death march disguised as strategy. Saladin knew every inch of that land. He knew where the Crusaders would struggle, where they would grow desperate, where they would begin to fall apart. He ordered his mounted archers to swarm around the moving column, striking from a distance, shooting clouds of arrows, withdrawing before the Crusader cavalry could counterattack. They did little immediate damage, but they accomplished something far more dangerous. They slowed the march to a crawl, tormented the exhausted infantry, denied the Crusaders a moment of rest, and denied them access to water. Then Saladin unleashed a weapon more devastating than arrows. He set the land on fire. His troops ignited the dry grass and brush along the Crusaders' path. The smoke rolled across the hills, choking the soldiers, stinging their eyes, and driving them toward madness. Dehydration set in quickly. The sun hammered down relentlessly. The knights' armor grew so hot that some could not touch it with bare hands. By late afternoon, the march had dissolved into chaos. Men collapsed on the roadside. Horses stumbled and fell. The infantry lagged farther and farther behind, abandoning shields and gear to lighten their loads. There was shouting, panic, confusion. And still Saladin's archers circled them, shooting, harassing, driving them deeper into despair. The Crusaders never reached Tiberias. Instead, with nightfall approaching and their entire force on the verge of collapse, they veered toward the twin hills of Hattin, a desolate, waterless ridge that would become their tomb. Saladin watched from a distance as the exhausted army dragged itself up the slopes and made a miserable camp. Surrounded, cut off from water, they were already beaten before the battle had even begun. The Sultan ordered his men to camp at the nearest springs. The Crusaders could see the glow of the Muslim campfires and hear the sounds of running water, but they could not reach it. Saladin had trapped them, and he had not lost a single soldier. During the night, his men continued setting fires around the Crusader camp, sending thick smoke into the enclosed valley between the horns of Hattin. The smell of burning brush, mixed with the dust and the cries of dying horses, filled the air. Many Crusader infantrymen, driven insane by thirst, attempted to flee in the darkness. Those who descended the hill were captured, cut down, or forced back. By dawn, the army that had marched proudly out of Sephoria was reduced to a trembling, half-delirious mass of men barely able to stand. And at sunrise on July 4th, Saladin prepared to finish what he had begun. The Crusader kingdom would never recover. Dawn crept slowly over the barren hills of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, revealing a sight both pitiful and foreboding. The Crusader army, once proud and resplendent in its heavy armor and colorful banners, now looked more like a mass of shadows swaying weakly in the morning haze. The men were exhausted beyond comprehension. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, their tongues swollen, their armor caked with dust and smoke. Many could barely lift their shields. Horses lay collapsed along the rocky slopes, their ribs showing, their eyes lifeless. The night had offered no rest, only torment. And as the sun rose again, the temperature began climbing toward another merciless day. Saladin's army, by contrast, was fresh and ready. They had slept near water. They had eaten. They had drunk deeply at the springs of Hattin. Their horses were strong and alert, their weapons polished, their ranks organized. The contrast was so stark that some Muslim chroniclers later wrote that it felt less like a battle and more like a divine judgment. When the first horns echoed across the valley, Saladin's troops closed in from all sides. The Crusaders raised their shields, but their formations were shaky. The infantry, suffering worst from thirst, quickly broke ranks. Within minutes, thousands of foot soldiers abandoned the hill entirely and made a desperate run toward Lake Tiberias in the distance, the shimmer of its waters like a cruel mirage calling them to salvation. But the Sultan had prepared for this. His cavalry surged forward like a tide and cut off the fleeing infantry. There was no mercy in that direction, only slaughter and captivity. The cries of the dying rose across the plain as the Crusader foot soldiers were swept aside. The knights who remained on the hill watched in helpless horror as the backbone of their army was torn away. Now only the mounted nobles, the elite knights, and the commanders of the kingdom remained clustered around the relic of the true cross at the summit of the hill. The priest bearing the cross raised it high, hoping to restore courage to the broken army. For a moment, the gleaming gold caught the morning sun, and the knights rallied with a desperate, feverish energy. They formed a tight circle around the relic and prepared for a final stand. Yet even the bravest men could not fight without strength, and thirst had drained them of everything. Raymond of Tripoli, who had warned them all, saw that the battle was lost beyond hope. Gathering the knights of Tripoli, those few who still had mounts and enough vigor left to fight, he launched a sudden, powerful charge against the Muslim line positioned on the western side of the hill. But instead of bracing for impact, the Muslim riders parted, opening a corridor through their ranks as if guiding the charge deliberately. Raymond and his men burst through the gap and escaped the battlefield entirely. For centuries, historians have debated what happened. Was it an act of treachery? Had Raymond secretly negotiated safe passage with Saladin? Or, and perhaps more likely, had Saladin simply decided the Count was no longer a threat and allowed him to flee so the rest of the Crusaders could be encircled more easily? Whatever the truth, Raymond vanished from the battlefield, leaving behind the very men who had dragged the kingdom into this doomed march. The remaining leaders, the king, the Templar master Gérard de Riedfort, Renaud de Châtillon, and the high nobles, were trapped. But they did not surrender. Instead, they attempted one last series of desperate charges. Twice, perhaps 3 times, the armored knights thundered down the slope, trying to reach the center of Saladin's line, hoping to strike directly at the Sultan himself. Each time, the Muslim ranks absorbed the charge, bending but not breaking. Saladin's soldiers fired arrows into the knights at close range, their horses faltered, and the surviving riders were driven back up the hill. On the final charge, the knights had no horses left. They stumbled forward on foot, hacking and slashing with trembling arms. But the ring of steel around them grew tighter, and their small patch of earth at the top of the hill shrank with each passing minute. At last, the Muslim forces surged up the slopes in a coordinated assault. The Crusader standard, King Guy's red tent, still fluttered stubbornly near the summit, but it offered no hope. The Bishop of Acre, guardian of the true cross, was captured. The sacred relic, the very symbol of the Crusader kingdom, was ripped from its bearers and seized by Saladin's men. A wave of panic washed over the defenders as the symbol that had guided them for generations disappeared into enemy hands. Some knights fell to their knees in despair. Others fought on with the last of their strength until they were cut down. When one of Saladin's warriors tore down the king's banner, the battle was finished. The defenders, still alive, threw down their weapons. They were surrounded, beaten, dehydrated, and utterly defeated. The army that had marched into battle with songs and pride had been completely destroyed. The sun had done its work. So had pride. So had stubbornness. Now came the reckoning. The prisoners were taken before Saladin's command pavilion, King Guy de Lusignan, his brother Amalric, the Templar master Gerard de Riedfort, and of course the man whose arrogance had ignited this war, Renaud de Chatillon. Dust-covered, trembling, and nearly delirious from thirst, the leaders of the Crusader kingdom stood before the victor. Saladin, in contrast, was calm, composed, and dignified. He offered King Guy a seat beside him under the shade of the pavilion. When he saw the king's condition, he ordered a servant to bring a cup of cold water mixed with rose syrup. It was a gesture of great honor. Guy drank eagerly. Then, acting according to Western custom, he passed the cup to Renaud. Seeing this, Saladin spoke sharply through an interpreter. "It was not I who gave him the drink." In Islamic tradition, to offer food or drink to a captive was to grant protection. Guy had given Renaud the cup. Saladin had not. The Sultan turned to Renaud and recited the long list of his crimes. He spoke of violated truces, robbed caravans, murdered pilgrims, and broken oaths. Renaud responded with defiance even now. No apology, no remorse, no humility. That sealed his fate. Saladin rose from his seat, drew his sword, and personally struck Renaud across the neck. Accounts vary on whether the blow killed him instantly or whether a guard finished the job, but all agree on one thing: the Sultan fulfilled his vow. The man who had tormented the Muslim world for years died at his feet. King Guy trembled, certain he was next, but Saladin reassured him. "A king does not kill another king," he said. Guy's life was spared, not because he was respected, but because he was no longer a threat. A broken king without an army posed no danger to the Sultan's designs. Others were treated according to rank and circumstance. Many nobles were spared for ransom. Most common soldiers were sold into slavery. But there was one group for whom Saladin reserved a harsher fate. The knights of the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, were lined up outside the camp. They had fought with unmatched fury, refusing to break even as the rest of the army collapsed. Saladin admired their courage, but he also feared their fanatic resolve. These were not ordinary knights. They were warrior monks, bound by vows, sworn to eternal war. As long as they lived, peace could never be secure. One by one, they were offered a choice: convert to Islam and live, or refuse and die. Not a single knight renounced his faith. At sunset, hundreds of them were executed. It was not rage that guided Saladin's decision, but calculation. By removing them, he stripped the Crusader kingdom of the hardened professional core that had anchored its defenses for nearly a century. Only one Templar was spared, Gerard de Riedfort. Saladin intended to ransom him. Ironically, the man whose reckless pride had helped lead the army to destruction was allowed to live, while the braver, more disciplined brothers of his order were cut down. The slaughter at Hattin was complete. In 2 days, the Crusader kingdom had lost its entire field army, its infantry, its cavalry, its commanders, and its holy relic. But the true consequences of Hattin were only beginning. The news spread across the Holy Land with stunning speed. Without the field army, the kingdom was defenseless. Its system of fortresses and port cities depended on the army to relieve sieges. Now there was no one left to come to the rescue. Saladin understood this better than anyone. He did not pause to celebrate. He divided his forces and struck with lightning speed. Tiberias surrendered immediately. Acre, the greatest port of the kingdom, fell 4 days after the battle. Then came Haifa, Caesarea, Arsuf. City after city capitulated. One by one, the castles and fortresses, the pride of Crusader engineering, opened their gates or were abandoned entirely. There were no soldiers left to defend them. The kingdom collapsed like a dying star. By the end of summer, only the city of Tyre remained defiant, saved by the timely arrival of the energetic Conrad of Montferrat, who turned it into an impregnable fortress. Everywhere else, the cross had fallen. There remained only one goal, one city, one prize that had dominated the imaginations of warriors for generations: Jerusalem, and Saladin was ready to take it. By the time September 1187 arrived, the once mighty Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was little more than a ghost. Its fortresses, those towering strongholds of stone that had guarded the roads, coasts, and mountain passes for nearly a century, now flew the banners of Saladin. Its armies were gone, swallowed either by the fires of Hattin or by the chains of captivity. Its nobles were scattered, dead, or hiding behind the thick walls of a dwindling number of refugees. And in the center of this collapsing world stood the holy city itself, Jerusalem, the heart of the Crusader dream, the prize for which thousands of pilgrims had crossed seas and deserts, and for which hundreds of thousands had died. Jerusalem, though filled with refugees and trembling with fear, had almost no soldiers left to defend it. The great lords were gone. The professional warriors of the military orders had perished at Hattin. The vast majority of knights who had once patrolled the roads of the kingdom now lay lifeless on the scorched plateau. The defenses of the city rested in the hands of a single nobleman who had not expected, nor desired, to lead its final stand: Balian of Ibelin. Balian had escaped the catastrophe at Hattin only by a desperate flight, and even then he had no intention of taking up arms again. He had sworn an oath to Saladin, allowing him to travel to Jerusalem solely to retrieve his wife and children. Saladin had granted him safe passage on the condition that he would not bear weapons against the Sultan. But when Balian reached the city and saw it overflowing with terrified refugees, women, children, priests, monks, old men, he realized that leaving Jerusalem would mean abandoning tens of thousands to slaughter. He sent word to Saladin, confessing that he could not keep his vow, for the defense of the city now depended on him. Saladin, demonstrating once again the strange mixture of sternness and magnanimity that defined him, released Balian from his oath. The Sultan knew the end was near regardless. Jerusalem, surrounded and helpless, would fall within weeks. If the city wished to resist, so be it. Nothing could change the outcome. On September 20th, Saladin's armies swept across the hills surrounding Jerusalem and encircled the city. Balian took stock of his impossible task. Among the tens of thousands inside the walls, only a handful could fight. He armed blacksmiths, merchants, monks, and boys barely old enough to hold a spear. He knighted 60 men, many of them commoners elevated out of sheer necessity. Every able-bodied person was given a place on the walls. Saladin opened the siege with a bombardment from siege engines and catapults. Stones hammered the battlements. Arrow fire rained down. Day after day, the defenders pushed back assaults with boiling water, burning oil, rocks, and whatever weapons they could improvise. Despite their inexperience, they fought with desperate courage. The memory of 1099, when the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem with a massacre so brutal that the streets reportedly ran with blood, haunted them. They knew what fate awaited them if the city fell by storm. But Saladin was not blind to the cost of a prolonged siege. Jerusalem was holy to Islam as well. It was the place of the Prophet's night journey, home to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He did not want his soldiers to destroy the city in the frenzy of battle, nor did he wish to be remembered as a conqueror who drenched sacred ground in blood. Still, his refusal to negotiate early in the siege reflected the intoxicating tide of victories behind him. He had retaken almost the entire kingdom in mere weeks. Jerusalem, he believed, should fall as decisively as its army had. Balian made one attempt to negotiate surrender soon after the siege began, but Saladin rejected the offer. He declared that the city would be taken by force, just as the Crusaders had taken it 90 years earlier. The Sultan's words echoed like a death sentence across the walls. Knowing the city was doomed, Balian continued reinforcing the defenses. But Saladin's engineers were patient and methodical. They identified a section of wall that was weaker than the rest and began digging a long, deep tunnel beneath one of the towers. Day after day, the sound of picks and shovels reverberated underground as the Muslims carved a cavity beneath the foundations. Finally, they packed the tunnel with dry wood and set it ablaze. When the supports burned through, the tower collapsed with a thunderous roar, leaving a massive breach in the city wall. Panic surged through Jerusalem. Women screamed, children cried, monks huddled in the churches praying for a miracle that would not come. The defenders rushed to fill the gap with makeshift barricades, wagons, timber beams, wooden doors. But they knew it would not hold. On the next assault, the Muslims would pour through the breach and the city would be lost. At that moment of despair, Balian made a final, desperate gamble. He went to Saladin's camp under a flag of truce. This time, he did not beg for mercy. Instead, he spoke with a calm born of hopeless determination. If Saladin refused to grant terms, Balian declared, the people of Jerusalem would take matters into their own hands. They would destroy every Muslim holy site in the city, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa, and every relic or shrine. They would kill every Muslim prisoner. They would kill their own women and children to spare them from enslavement, and then the remaining defenders would charge into Saladin's army and fight until the last man fell, killing as many Muslims as possible in the process. It was not a bluff. Desperate people truly might have done such horrors. Saladin hesitated. His advisors urged him to consider the consequences. Jerusalem was not merely a political objective. It was Islam's third holiest city. Its desecration would be an unthinkable tragedy. For all his victories, Saladin did not wish his legacy to be stained by the destruction of the holy city. In the end, he agreed to negotiations. The terms were unexpectedly humane, so humane, in fact, that even some Christian chroniclers later praised Saladin's conduct. Every man, woman, and child would be allowed to leave the city if they paid a ransom. 10 dinars for each man, 5 for each woman, and 1 for each child. Those who paid would walk free, accompanied by Saladin's guards to prevent harm from looters or bandits. The wealthy bought freedom easily, but the poor, thousands upon thousands, had nothing. Here, both Saladin and Balian showed compassion. The treasuries of the city and of the church were emptied to buy the freedom of as many poor families as possible. Saladin himself contributed money from his own coffers. His brother Al-Adil paid for the release of hundreds more. Even so, some remained who could not afford their ransom. For these, Saladin eventually relented and allowed them to go free anyway. Elderly people were released without payment. No massacre occurred, no looting, no burning of churches. On October 2nd, 1187, the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, Saladin entered Jerusalem not as a butcher, but as a conqueror who knew the world was watching. His soldiers marched in disciplined formation. He ordered the Christian churches protected. Only one, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was temporarily closed while arrangements were made regarding its administration. Saladin personally oversaw the removal of the golden cross the Crusaders had placed atop the Dome of the Rock, replacing it with the crescent. The true cross, captured at Hattin, was paraded through the city and later sent to Damascus as a symbol of victory. The fall of Jerusalem reverberated throughout Europe like an earthquake. Priests wept in the streets. Kings swore vengeance. The Pope, upon hearing the news, was said to have died from the shock. From the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire came the outraged cry for a new crusade, one greater than any before it. The kings of Europe themselves would take the cross, from Richard the Lionheart to Philip Augustus to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. But that was a story still waiting to unfold. For now, Saladin had achieved what had once seemed impossible. He had destroyed the Crusader army, dismantled their kingdom, and reclaimed Jerusalem for Islam. It was a triumph of strategy as much as courage, of patience as much as military power. And at its core lay the relentless logic of Hattin. One battle, one disaster, one irrevocable mistake that shattered a kingdom built over 90 years of blood and devotion. Yet victory brought responsibilities and challenges of its own, and the Sultan knew the war was not over. The West would come, with kings, with armies, with fleets, and the greatest clash of the Crusades was drawing near.